afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Julian and welcome to Beer Boot Camp Sessions. I am live this evening with a very esteemed gentleman, very much so. John joined Fuller Smith and Turner, otherwise known as Fuller's, as a junior brewer in 1981. It was 18 years before becoming the head brewer, and then on that position he was there for a further 18 years after that as well. In 1999 he was promoted to the director of brewing, the head brewer at Fuller's, and in January 2017 he was handed over the reins to Georgina Young, Fuller's first ever female brewster, and obviously that's changed since then. However, he is still a global ambassador for the company, which involves traveling the world, tasting and talking about beer. And in 2017, he was awarded SIBA's Silver Tankard Lifetime Achievement Award. Welcome, John. Thanks for being with us this evening.
Yeah, thank you. It's great to be here.
Excellent. And John, from his living room, as you can see, is practicing social distancing very, very well. Very good.
Billy no mate.
Yeah, Billy no mates.
There we go. There we go. This evening, we're going to be speaking a bit about recipe development, as well as obviously a successful or planning a successful brewery. What are your thoughts about that? And no, we're not going to put a recipe together for bread, because there's a lot of bread people on the stream as well. We've been talking about sourdough the whole week, because we can do that.
Excellent.
But
well,
I think let's talk about beer.
Yeah, let's talk about beer. I mean, to me, the most important part of recipe development is inspiration. What is your inspiration? I think if you don't have that inspiration, then you don't make a great beer. So, for instance, if, for instance, you think, oh, I'd really like to make a beer with Sriracha Ace. I've never used it before as a hop. Let's use it. If you've tasted other people's beers with that in and say, oh, it's a great flavor, or you've smelt the hop, or you've seen samples of the hop and you get inspired by it to make a beer with it, that's great. But if you see that loads of people are using Sriracha Ace and you've never seen it or drank a beer with Sriracha Ace, you're just jumping on the bandwagon, and therefore your beer won't be that good. So you have to look first at what your inspiration for making a beer is. So for a good example from when I was at Fuller's was I was the head brewer, and I wanted to try and inspire people, but I also wanted to empower them and make them think. And so I said to one of our young brewers, Henry, who's now the head brewer at Darkstar, I said, look, I think it's about time we made a sour. Go away and tell me how you would do it. And I saw that people were making sours, and I was really interested in sours. We'd been to America and we drank a few, and Simon, my partner, she really loved them. And I thought, well, this is a great way for bringing people who don't normally drink, say, malty or hoppy beers, to drink a sour beer, because they have some wine-like character. So I went to our team and I took Henry to one side, and I was hoping that he would come up with a recipe, that he would come up, but he went about it a different way. He went to see somebody who was really good at making sours. He got hold of somebody from California, Heretic Brewing, Jamil there, and he asked him how to do it. And Jamil said, you know what? I've always wanted to come to Fuller's. Can I come and make it with you? And that's how they come up with a recipe and a way of doing it together. And I thought that was a really inspired way of going about it. So firstly, if you're going to design a recipe, get some inspiration from somewhere. Then once you're inspired to make a beer, say you want to make the best barley wine in the world. Okay, that's your inspiration. That's what you want to do. That's what you're chasing after. That's your vision. That's where you want to go. Then how do you go about doing that? Well, you have to taste a number of barley wines, the ones that really impress you, and say, well, what's good about them? And try and analyze it in your own mind. I also think it's a really good idea to drink ones you don't like. because you find out and say, well, I don't want it to taste like that. I don't want it to be like that. So you can learn as much about things where things go wrong or you don't like something, just as much as you can learn by things going right. And then when you find barley wines that you really like, try and find what was behind that particular recipe. Speak to the brewers. Brewers are very open and they will tell you, you know, Fuller's own recipe for Golden Pride, our barley wine, was just basically pale ale, crystal malt, and a little bit of chocolate. And the secret was really the yeast. The yeast fermented that beer really well. And what you've got to realize as well is that recipes just don't start and stop with the hop and the malt. They go through fermentation, through packaging, through storage. So for instance, barley wines really age really well. Do you want this beer to be aged before you drink it? It all comes down to you and what you feel about the beer you want to make. And it has to come from within you, not from other people, from within you or your team at the brewery. And that's where I start.
So a good thing is to look at saying, listen here, right, I really like this beer. Do I know a brewer that makes this beer really well? Contact the brewer, say, listen here, I love your beer. I want to brew something similar in my brew house, or want to brew something like this at home. Let's look at something together and that we can make something. And obviously, once again, you got to have the passion behind it. Don't say, I want to brew a beer and like walk away. Like, you've got to be serious about that. And this is where us as well, where we look at a recipe and say, right, you got to put everything into that recipe from scratch. It's not going to be a half-hearted thing. You got to go in full. It's going to cost a bit of money initially, because you got to understand, if you obviously don't get it right the first time, are you willing to dump it and do it a second time?
Or you can learn from where you make a mistake when you make it. You can start off with small scale home brewing and build it up to a recipe on your plant. We used to do that. We used to do some laboratory trials. It's always good to look at ingredients as well. I remember when we were developing London Porter, we got maltsters in, and we said, look, we want to make a porter, and the maltsters were suggesting malts we could use in a porter, and they gave us brown malt. I'd never used brown malt. This was way back in 1995. I'd never used brown malt as a brewer, and they give us this brown malt, and it had this fantastic flavour. And I thought, we've got to get that in the beer. Sometimes when you use malt, when it goes through the fermentation, it changes so much, it's not particularly recognisable straight away from the raw material what the flavour in the beer is. But with this, straight away, you can taste brown malt in porter. And we used 10% of the recipe was brown malt, and it shows you that you don't have to overuse the specialist malts. So porter was 10% brown malt, 10% low color crystal, 1% chocolate malt, and the rest was pale ale malt. So you don't have to overuse it. And I think also you can get so enamored with the flavor, and people who use certain hops do this. You get so enamored with the flavor, that's all the beer tastes of. There's nothing behind it. So there's no complexity, there's no supporting flavors. And you should always have those supporting flavors, because those supporting flavors help the beer stay interesting all the way through the glass. There's nothing worse than tasting a fantastic flavor with your first 2 or 3 sips and then getting so satiated and so fed up of it, you can't finish the glass. There has to be a balance in there. And by balance, I don't mean everything is sort of neutral or in the middle of the road. I mean, the balance is there to support the flavors you want the beer to exhibit. So if you want to make a really hoppy IPA, for instance, that has great hop notes, you still need that malty and that yeasty flavors to be there, the fruity yeasty flavors to be there as supporting flavors. You don't notice them at first, but you only notice them 3/4 of the way through the glass, or like I like to say, 3/4 of the way through your 4th pint. Then you notice another flavor, and that's what keeps you interesting and keeps you drinking the beer. There's worst beers are those that satiate your palate and you don't want to have another one after you've had the first. Those are, you know, especially if you're drinking in an English pub.
Correct, yeah. So you actually want to always maintain that balance between your ingredients. You don't want to have one overpowering the other one, you know, and like you said, you're picking up something new on your fourth pint, which is normally good because you say this is if you picked a pint that you would drink for the rest of your life, you'd obviously pick a pint that is well balanced, that tastes good every single time. It's not going to be a pint that you basically, well, that was great, and I might have another one. You would say, well, that was fantastic, and I'll drink it for the rest of my life, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, that is something to inspire you to do, isn't it? I want to make a beer I want to drink for the rest of my life. That's a good inspiration.
Very much so. On that note, tell me what beer do you really obviously enjoyed brewing when you were at Fuller's? Your favorite of the range? I mean, you've got a magnificent range. We've actually got one of the viewers on this evening that's just cracked open the 170th anniversary ale, which, you know, and I've got one of the Fuller's the vintage ales.
Oh, you got vintage
with me this evening. Oh, I got a vintage.
That's really a barley wine.
Yes, the 20. That's the Golden Pride, basically, that you've put into bottles. So that's the 2016 I've got. I've also got a 2018. What was your favorite beer that you looked at brewing every single time?
Yeah, well, the beers I like the best are the ones you drink in the pub over an evening, which means they can't be fantastically strong because you end up getting too drunk. So my favorite beers at Fuller's was I would like to drink Chiswick Bitter, which is only 3.5% in alcohol. And I could drink that over lunchtime or in the evening. And then in the evening, I might finish off with ESB. And ESB is really Chiswick Bitter's big brother. They've both got identical recipes in terms of hops and grist, but one is just stronger than the other. And because of that strength, and they are fermented at that strength, and the fermentation is altered by strength. So, for instance, ESB fermentation is a lot longer, and therefore it produces slightly different flavors to what Chiswick Bitter. Chiswick Bitter is always best drunk fresh, whereas ESB is best drunk with a little bit of age on it. So we used to have landlords where they would buy casks of ESB, casks of Chiswick. Chiswick they would put on straight away and have a very low stock of Chiswick. Whereas some landlords would not put the firkin or the kilderkin of ESB until it was 3 weeks old. And it was a beer that had a 5-week shelf life. So Chiswick Bitter went straight away onto the stillage. ESB they left on the floor for 3 weeks because they thought it tasted better when it was 3 weeks old, not when it was 1 week old. So and that's another thing, is that the landlord with cask beer in particular has such an influence over the flavor of the beer. And when you're designing a beer, you have to design it with that mind, especially for a cask beer, that the landlord will finish it off. You're taking it to 90% of its flavor attributes, but it needs that final 10% in the cellar. So again, when you're developing a recipe, you have to think, well, what is its final package? If I produce it, is it going into small pack? Is it going into can? Is it going into bottle? Or is it going into draft? And frequently, you have to tweak them to be ideal for that presentation. So particularly with cask and bottle, they were so different, in our opinion, at Fuller's, because the bottle beers were much more fizzier, and the more CO2 you have in a beer, it affects the flavor. And also, generally, people drank bottle beers colder than they drank cask beer. Cask beer is ideal 13, 11, 12, 13 degrees centigrade, maybe 14 even, depending on the strength of the beer. But a lot of people drank bottle beers at 8, 9 degrees centigrade. And when you chill something, you affect the flavor. So what we decided to do for a lot of our beers was to brew them at different strengths. If we were going into small pack, we would make the beer stronger because the flavour was diminished by the CO2, effect of CO2, and by the effect of chilling. So we wanted more flavour. Plus, the bottled beers had to last 12 months. So we wanted more resilience in them, whereas the cask beer lasts 5 weeks. So again, you're not just producing a beer for its flavour. You want great flavour, obviously, but you're also producing it. How long is its shelf life? How long has it got to last for? So you have to brew it with a mind to making it resilient in its package and throughout its shelf life. So there's lots of things to consider. You know, that what's its CO2 content? What's your preferred CO2 content? That will affect the flavour. So it's not just what malt I'm going to use, what hops I'm going to use, but how am I going to mature this? How am I going to package it? And how much CO2 am I going to put into it? What temperature is it going to be served at? All those should be taken account in your brewing.
So one of the things that we've looked at as well is no one loves your beer better than you. No one treats it better than you. Once it goes out into distribution, you've got to rely on, as you said, the last mile almost. Basically, when it gets to one of the resellers' sellers, they got to look after it for the next 2 to 3 weeks. As you said, your Chiswick bitter, you've got to move it as quick as possible, whereas the ESB, you've got to give it a bit more time to continue in the cellar as well. So we've got the same thing when we do the packaging. Make sure what you get in your packaging is the same as on what you're selling on tap at the same time in distribution. One of the questions coming in at the moment, if we had a choice of drinking one beer for the rest of your life, what would it be?
Yeah, well, I mean, Chiswick bitter is my favourite beer but again, you cannot, beers change on the circumstances that you're drinking them, on the occasion. I love Chiswick bitter because I love being in the pub with my friends, chatting to them, having a chat. Whereas if I was at home, for a beer, I might choose vintage ale. But vintage ale is great to share with people, so that you open up that bottle and you each have a small glass of it, and I think that's one of the great things. So it depends on the occasion as well. So, but my favourite occasion is drinking beer in the pub, and I like a good pint of cask bitter, and I'm not particularly worried whose it is. I mean, I love Timothy Taylor's when I'm in Yorkshire. And again, one of the things that's happening in Britain is we're beginning to lose regional flavours because the world is shrinking, and people are, people are imitating other regions. So a classic example of this from way back in the 70s was that brewers started advertising their beers with big heads on them. And they were mainly inspired by beers from Yorkshire and the North. And in the South, they did not have beers with heads on them. But they started to serve beer with big heads, which weren't designed to have big heads. Yeah, because flavour changes when you produce a lot of foam. I don't know if everybody knows this, but hop character and bitterness in particular is more soluble in foam than it is in liquid. So when you produce a beer with a big head and you pour it with a head on, a lot of the bitterness flavors go into the foam, and therefore the beer under the foam tastes more mellow. And the other effect it has is if you leave your beer long enough, say you drink half of it and then you leave it, the foam redissolves back in the beer, making the last half more intensely bitter than the first half. So again, these were issues that people had to take on, and now even in London, people like beer with a head. But the reason why there was this sort of regional variation in originally, all beer would have been poured directly from the barrel. So you tap the barrel, then you pour it, and generally the barrel would be kept in the cellar. So if you wanted a pint of beer, the barmaid would walk into the cellar, pour a beer into a jug and leave the jug on the bar, and then pour beers out as you wanted them, which meant that most beers look quite flat. You pour a beer into a jug, a cask beer into a jug, and then you take it to the bar, and then you re-pour it. You don't get a lot of head on the top. So that's how people were used to drinking it. And then when the Industrial Revolution in Britain came about, is they found that people were finishing their shift and then going to the pub straight away for a beer, and they were turning up 20, 30 people at a time. And if you had to wait for the barmaid to go and fill a jug up from the cellar, by the time the last person got served, you know, they had to wait an hour for a beer.
Yeah.
That was no good. So they invented the beer engine. Right? And if you pour beer fast through a beer engine, you get a big head. So all the sort of industrial cities of the North and the Midlands suddenly were getting beers with big heads. And the only time that you didn't get a big head was if there was something wrong with the beer. So they automatically assumed that any beer with no head on it was a bad pint of beer. So when they went out into the countryside or into the southern part of the country, which hadn't had the industrialization perhaps, then they found that the beers were being poured from a jug with no head on it. So they said it's rubbish. They didn't even bother tasting it. So that's how regionalization affects things like head and flavor. But unfortunately now, in the modern world, regionalization is dying. Everybody wants to make IPAs inspired by California or America, etc. So they're just making copies of American IPAs. When I was in South Africa with you, one of the things I was saying to brewers was you should draw inspiration from the ingredients you can get from South Africa. If you're going to make an IPA, make a South African IPA. Don't make an imitation of an American IPA. Yeah, the Americans can do that. Leave that to them. Make South Africa beers for South African people. You've got the ingredients there to make great beers, I think.
Brilliant. One of the questions from one of the viewers at the moment is, does stronger beer mean higher alcohol only or more malt and hop flavors too?
Oh, flavor is affected by strength. So that, for instance, when I was talking about ESB and Chiswick Bitter and London Pride all have the same recipe. The main difference is they're fermented at different strengths, which makes the yeast react differently, which gives it different flavors. So ESB does taste different to London Pride, and London Pride does taste different to Chiswick Bitter, and that's mainly because of the way they ferment. So it doesn't just mean stronger in alcohol, but it also means how the balance of the flavors. So yeast can give you much more fruitier flavors at stronger OGs. You get much more fruity and estery flavors. So for instance, Fuller's was very famous for getting orange notes into its beer, but you didn't really notice them till you were tasting Fuller's beers of a strength of an ESB at 5.5 to 6%. You didn't notice orange flavors in London Pride at 4% or Chiswick Bitter at 3.5%, but you noticed it, and you noticed it in Bengal Lancer, our English version of IPA, because they had the strength and the yeast. You certainly notice it in Vintage Ale and Golden Pride, because the yeast, that's how the yeast reacted when you fermented a beer that was at 1090 instead of a beer that was at 1035.
So you were using the same yeast across the range, same
Yes.
recipe. It was just the gravity of each
Yeah.
beer that made a big difference.
So you can imagine initially what you have, because you have more sugar dissolved in the wort, you have a different osmotic pressure, which affects the uptake through the yeast. Yeah. So as the yeast is taking sugars through its permeable membrane, it's affected differently because of the osmotic pressure. And then as the yeast excretes alcohol, the alcohol is a poison to yeast too. So it slows it down. and changes the way it ferments, which in turn gives you different flavors. So if you produce an identical beer with the same malt and the same hops, and you produce one with twice as much malt and twice as much hops, but same proportion, the fermentation will be different with the same yeast, because the osmotic pressure is different to start with, and then the alcohol changes and it is different. So you have to have a different effect.
Brilliant. Absolutely.
That's why
brilliant.
high gravity brewing does not work.
Yeah.
You know what high gravity brewing was, where brewers decided to cut down on the amount of fermenting vessels they had. So to produce a beer of 4%, they would say ferment it at 7% and then dilute it with water back to 4%. Well, it didn't work, because those flavors were totally different. Having produced a beer at 7% and 4%, the two flavors were different. And they also have enormous trouble when you want to dilute beer. Diluting beer 5%, yes, but diluting it 40%, no, can't be done.
Tell me,
Not to make great
John,
beer.
No, of course, of course. And tell me, what was the most experimental beer you have ever brewed?
Well, I think when we produced that sour beer was the most experimental I got in the massive plant at Fuller's. But just as I was leaving in my final year, we bought a 10-barrel experimental plant, which now means they can experiment pretty well. But when Jamil came from Heretic and we said, like, we're going to make a goza. So let's what are we going to do? We're going to make a fruit one. What fruit should we use? Let's use blackberries, because they are an English fruit. So we made a blackberry goza, and that was a sour beer. We kettle soured it. When you kettle sour in 320 barrels or 520 hectoliters, it's quite fun. You just
I'm
hope
sure.
it doesn't
I'm
go
sure.
wrong, especially when it's the first time you've ever done it.
Yeah, that's a big thing about experimental beer as well. Is, like I said, when you're doing experimental beer, you've got to take it and say, listen, yeah, if it's not good, you're going to have to be willing to throw it away. So it's the risk that you take when you're doing beers like that, and hope that when you've soured it correctly, you've boiled it correctly, ensure that everything's sanitized, as we always talk about, end to end. And then obviously fermentation works out well, you'll get a good balanced sour beer.
Yeah.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
We actually had Fel on the other night from Anderson Valley talking about sours as well, and using mixed cultures and that, which is really, really exciting. Moving on slightly, what do you think of a blonde stout?
Is that possible? Is there such a thing? You know, I think it's a contradiction. But stouts to me and porters have to be produced using dark malts, using roasted malts in particular, because porters and stouts have this, to me, the best ones have really good roasted flavors. And I much prefer the London versions of stouts and porters to the Irish versions of stouts and porters. So having a blonde stout, I can't really comprehend what that actually would be and would taste like. I've never tasted one. I know some people, I don't know whether people are joking when they say they can have a go at trying to do something like this. But I just feel something light coloured shouldn't be called a stout.
It's in the color. It's in the color.
Yeah, it's in the colour.
And that's the whole thing. So I actually have had and tasted a blonde stout, and the first thing is you close your eyes, they put it in front of you, you taste it, you go, oh yeah, that could part, and then you look at it and you go, but wait, that's just not right.
Yeah. Well, that's the other thing is, you know, setting the beer in front of somebody, as soon as you see it, you taste with your eyes as well. And what you're doing by producing that is you're shocking people. Doesn't mean you're delighting them. It means you're shocking them, making them think. But that's great for one-offs. But how many times will you go back and produce it and drink it?
Sure, 100%. You know, and that's the thing. It's like it is a shock, because the first thing, and you were saying, it's the same way that people look at beer without a head and beer with a head. It's already, the decision's made
Yeah.
whether you're going to drink it or not, you know.
Yeah.
And as you know, cask through a sprinkler gives you a nice foamy head. Some beer that you've poured directly off there is also cask, but it's got low CO2, low carbonation, and almost no head at the same time.
Well, it's all about perception. And so, for instance, if I say I am the head brewer of Fuller's, and I say to a group of people, taste this beer, it's a really good beer, that group of people believe me, right? Because they think the head brewer of Fuller's must know what he's talking about, and they respect that position. Whereas if I say I am the marketing director of Fuller's, and this is a good beer, most of the people in the group won't believe me, and they'll think it's a bad beer. So it's the same beer, but you have one person telling you it's a good beer who you don't respect their opinion of, you automatically think the opposite. Whereas a person who you respect, you believe, and you're already thinking it's a good beer. And if you think it's a good beer, 9 times out of 10, it will be a good beer. If you think it's going to be a bad beer, 9 times out of 10, it's a bad beer. It's because you won't believe it if you don't trust your own taste buds.
And that's very important. You as a brewer need to have faith in your beer and obviously tasting your beer at the same time. In your water treatment, are all your treatments to the water exactly the same across the Fuller's brands, or do you have different water treatments for the different styles of beers?
Yeah, water treatment is pretty important, but it's the easiest to me to get right, because you're working with chemistry, and chemistry is very predictable. So if you get it right, then it's easy to reproduce. Whereas the rest of brewing is about biology, and biology is never easy to reproduce. So that's where the art of brewing comes in. The science of brewing, water treatment is a science. Now at Fuller's, we produced Fuller's beers and Gale's beers. And when we found that Gale's liquor treatment was about 15% different from the Fuller's treatment, so it was very easy to adjust Fuller's standard treatment to give it the same, to make it into a Gale's treatment. We had a slightly different treatment when we produced dark beers. We used to add much more gypsum to our bitters than we did to our porters, stouts, and milds, and we had pot chloride as well to the milds to give it help that sweet flavour come through. And those are the beers we concentrated on. With lagers, again, reducing the amount of salts in the water is important, and London water is not ideal for making lager type beers. So we produce very few lagers. But yes,
Excellent.
You have to get your liquor treatment correct.
Very good, very good. So now we're going to get to the second part of the Q&A quickly. And the first one is obviously, how do you think Fuller's managed to stand the test of time?
Well, I just think what it is it's going about what is your vision, and within the vision of the company are standards and values, and you always adhere to those standards and values. You might be making a lager which you've never produced, or you might be making a new beer that you've never produced, but you make them to the same standard and the same values that you've always held. And those values, when I was a head brewer, I was the guardian of the standards and values. I made sure that people adhered to them. That was my job. My job wasn't to make the beer so much. My job wasn't to help with fermentation. It wasn't to do all that. My job was to make sure that everybody else was doing their job according to the right standard and the right values. And if I was doing my job, then people wouldn't be tempted to cut corners, because they realize, no, this is important. We cannot. So if we have to boil for an hour, if we're running 3 hours late in a brew because we've had a problem. We cannot cut the boil to half an hour because it affects the flavour of the beer. It's our standard and our value to boil for an hour. We're going to boil for an hour, even if it means we go home 3 hours late. And so that's why Fuller's have been able to maintain themselves at the top, because even when you hand over from head brewer to head brewer, the previous head brewer to me had been 40 years with Fuller's, and I was 38 years with Fuller's, so that you learn those standards and values before you get the top job. And there were so many people at Fuller's who'd done 20 years, 25, 30 years. Those values were built into them. So when we took new people on, it was easy to make sure that they understood that they had to do it this way, that this is the best way to do it. And again, when we're developing new beers, we would apply the same processes to those new beers. So when we made a lager for the first time, we said we were going to lager it for 6 weeks, not 6 days, as some companies do, because we didn't think that you could make a proper beer of that type without doing lagering. Whereas a lot of, say, the mainstream British lagers are brewed on a Monday and packaged on a Friday. I don't see how they can call themselves lagers, but they do.
Yeah, no, a lot of big commercial beer these days, especially in South Africa, is probably 95% lager, and it's all big commercial lager, brewed in large capacities, and they get it out. I'm going to say fairly fast, which they do. I mean, they do all the conditioning, they take it to bright, they filter it, they package it, and they get it to the market as quickly as possible. For
their
us at
standards
the
and
moment,
values about making money.
and at the moment, that's all been brought to a complete halt, as you know. In South Africa, like we've discussed over the last couple of sessions, they have stopped the sale, manufacture, transport, production, anything to do with liquor or alcohol. So we've kind of come to a very much end of a standpoint. The big players in the market, obviously Heineken, SIBA, and that have always been trying to we need to get going again, because they obviously are the big players in the marketplace, on the taverns and things like that as well. So for us smaller brewers, it becomes a really big problem, because people that are obviously under the lock and key, we are going to have problems moving forward. Tell me, also, Fuller's Brewery been going for so long and everything. They obviously were recently in the last year, they were obviously taken over by SIBA and everything, but they've kept the same standards. They are obviously still brewing the same beers. Has anything changed from that point of view from your side that you've seen?
Well, I don't have day-to-day contact anymore with what's going on at the brewery. I think they've been in terms of marketing and sales, they've been in a little bit of a state of flux, trying to understand how to market, how to sell these beers. The brewers, however, I know Asahi have been very good in spending money at the brewery and developing the brewery and bringing forward projects that we wanted to do but could not find the money to do. So they've been very good. The brewers speak very highly of Asahi and what they've been doing. So it's still wait and see what goes on. Asahi have got a lot of opportunities with Fuller's. London Pride is a beer, I think, that it can easily have worldwide sales for them. So we will wait and see to see how they would do it. But I think they are determined to keep the site open in Chiswick, which I think is a good thing. There's room for development at that site. There's room to put more fermenting vessels in. So if they want to make more beer, I think they were going to have to take some of the transport off and the warehousing off site, because it won't be big enough for all the warehousing. Excuse me. But I think Asahi have an opportunity to do great things with Fuller's. I think it will take 5 years before we know fully, has it been a great thing or a bad thing. At the moment, the early signs are quite good.
Brilliant, good. And you're obviously still doing the odd brewery tour there as well, which is really, really good. One of the other viewers is actually just saying he had a London Pride at Ye Old Mitre the other day.
Yeah.
It was a fantastic pub.
In
It's still an
London.
amazing old pub in London.
Yeah.
We don't have one of those here. Was this one of your favorite pubs?
Oh, it was a cracking pub. It was a really interesting pub because we actually didn't buy it till probably about 2010. It became a Fuller's pub, and it's called the Old Mitre because it was named. It was in those days, and bishops sat in the House of Lords, and they had a London residence, and that residence was kept under their own diocese, not the diocese that was in London. So, for instance, it was Bishop Mawson of Ely who opened that, who lived there and had that pub. So he lived in Ely in East Anglia, Cambridge, and so the amazing thing was he was called Mawson. His original family owned the brewery at Fuller's before it became Fuller's. So when we bought the pub, we reunited the two sides of the family, sort of. The Fuller's, the side that became Fuller's, and the side that left that pub in Holborn. So that was a really interesting thing. And yes, it's a great pub. It is what I call a boozer. Yeah, they don't do loads of food. They don't do very much food. They do simple food to prepare, but they do it well. So you can have a good pie, I think, or a sandwich in there, but you're not going to get a 3-course meal or whatever. But they do great beer because they know how to look after it. It's a pub for drinkers rather than a pub restaurant.
People looking for a Michelin star brew pub, you know, when you're looking for your 3-course steak and all that kind of stuff. I don't think you're going to get that there.
No, but you get good beer, you get good simple food, and you also get good company.
Very good. And John, finally, before we say thank you very much for joining us, your best food pairing for a pint of London Pride.
Oh, wow. For a pint of London Pride, it's got to be in the pub. So I would say pie and chips.
Any particular pie?
A steak and ale pie, or a steak, mushroom and ale pie with some chips. Lunchtime in the pub, a couple of pints of London Pride. Excellent. Go back to work, have a snooze, then go home.
living the dream.
Well, that's what I used to do. But I can boast about it now. But I used to have to be very careful when I was doing it at work.
Yeah, sneak away for a quick lunch on the corner, and I remember that pub where we had.
I used to say to my team, if you're good enough, you only have to do half a day's work. I'm good enough, you're not.
Excellent job. John, thanks very much for joining us. Keep safe during the lockdown. Is there anything specific that you
Same to you, yeah.
Anything specific that you
just make sure that when you, all those breweries, those wonderful breweries and brewers I met in South Africa, as soon as that lockdown finishes, get making that great beer again.
We definitely will. We will do. We actually itching to get out. Today was meant to be the first day out until they extended it. So we're again under lockdown until the 30th. And yeah, it's going to be a tough couple of weeks heading up. But are you doing anything specific on the lockdown? Are you still taking walks? Are you going to? I mean, the pubs are obviously closed, I'm guessing.
No, the pubs are closed. You can take one walk per day. You can do one exercise. The highlight of the week is putting the bins out and watching the bin men come, because that's the only thing where you get some action. So that's the best thing of the week. But what I've been doing is I've been drinking my way through my drinks cabinet. I've been trying to leave some of my beer and get it spread out. But I've been getting into cocktails.
Ooh,
So I've been trying to use all the old booze I've had in the cocktail cabinet and using it up and making cocktails.
no, that's very, very good. John, before you leave us, just your top tips on producing a great bitter.
A great bitter. Well, firstly, it's got to be very drinkable. So make sure that you get your fermentation correct. Fermentation is the key to drinkability. Make sure you leave enough residual sugar in there to give it some body, but it can't be over sweet. It's got to be a good balance. But at the same time, you need a bit of body. And the second thing is have a decent fizz, because the fizz lifts the flavor. Yeah. So that's my tips for making a great bitter. Fermentation is the key.
Brilliant. Actually, thank you very much. John, thanks for joining us this Friday evening. We're wishing you and Simone all the best during the couple of days of lockdown ahead of you. And possibly we'll see you again soon on Beer Boot Camp sessions. Take care.
Yeah, look forward to it. I really want to get back to Joburg and see you chaps again.
Look forward to that as well. And thanks to everybody for joining us this evening on Beer Boot Camp. Don't forget to subscribe to the session. Leave your comments below. If you need any other questions from John, pop them in there and we'll pick his brain, because we know he's going nowhere for the next couple of weeks.
Got something to do.
Excellent. Thanks very much, John. Take care.
Cheerio. See ya.